In our lead story today, we're headed to the nation of Somalia, where American airstrikes have eliminated a high-ranking member of Islamic State. It was the first known targeted airstrike in Africa of the second Trump administration, and thus it may provide a telling window not just into the relevance of the Islamic State in Somalia, but into the threat evaluations made by America's new president. Islamic State, Somalia province, alternately known as ISIS or Abna al-Khalifa, has been active in the nation of Somalia since 2015, when a breakaway faction from Somalia's most famous jihadist insurgency, Al-Shabaab, pledged allegiance to what was a rapidly strengthening caliphate at that time. Swearing loyalty to the main Islamic State franchise in Iraq and Syria, ISIS briefly managed to capture a port town in 2016, although they've gone basically dormant ever since. They live and carry out attacks from hiding places in a range called the Golis Mountains, where they can do their business basically uninterrupted by federal or local authorities or by Al-Shabaab. There, an estimated 300 to 700 fighters, predominantly Ethiopians and other foreigners, rule over a handful of isolated villages and hamlets while carrying out occasional attacks elsewhere across the fractured nation. On February the 1st, however, Washington announced via President Donald Trump that US forces had carried out a series of airstrikes in the Golis Mountains in what was reported as a successful attack against a senior ISS member who was charged with planning attacks. According to newly minted Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, the ISS leader in question had been surrounded by other militants, many of whom are assessed to have also been killed, even as the strike reportedly caused no civilian casualties. The primary target was not identified by the US, but it's not likely to have been the man that international analysts assess to be the current leader of the group, Abdul Qadir Mamin. And that's owing to the fact that the US framed the strike as having targeted a senior attack planner rather than the head of the organization. That, however, is a speculative claim. The Somali government in Mogadishu acknowledged that it had been informed of the airstrike ahead of time and claimed, as Mogadishu often does, that the airstrike was a joint operation with Somali forces. Explaining the strike on social media, Trump wrote, quote, "These killers, who we found hiding in caves, threatened the United States and our allies. The strikes destroyed the caves they live in and killed many terrorists without in any way harming civilians." Now, in a world populated by a wide range of jihadist organizations that the United States regards as adversaries, it should perhaps be a little bit surprising that this particular small, low-level Islamic State franchise in the Somali mountains was the one chosen for a strike. After all, these certainly aren't the sorts of jihadists who could pull off an attack on US soil, and probably not even against America's very limited interests in Somalia. But US strikes against this particular Islamic State franchise are not new. In early 2023, under Joe Biden, an American airstrike killed a high-level ISS member who was reportedly a key intermediary with Islamic State forces around the world. The US has been involved in local efforts to beat the ISS back for years, and in fact, it's a group that America has put an outsized amount of work into trying to keep in check. To understand why, we've got to do something that longtime viewers of the Situation Room will be well accustomed to doing, and that's zooming out a little bit and understanding Somalia as a whole. Put simply, Somalia is barely a country at all. Its federal government, located in the capital city of Mogadishu, is weak, corrupt, and protected by a military whose best units could be described as under-equipped and unsupported, and whose average units could be described as inept. To the south, the country's breadbasket is under the control of a semi-autonomous government, Jubaland, who've had flaring tensions with the Somali government this year. The country's northeast tip is under the control of a different and more fully autonomous government called Puntland. This is where the Islamic State in Somalia has holed up in a mountain range that Puntland officials do claim but lack the ability to effectively patrol. Then, in the northwest, there's Somaliland, the most fully autonomous of all the breakaway regions, where until earlier this year, Ethiopia was doing business directly with the intent of building a major port, and where a range of international interests are tied up, much to the Mogadishu government's chagrin. Across the nation, Al-Shabaab is estimated to have anywhere from 7 to 20,000 fighters, holding an ever-morphing patchwork of territory in the country's heartland and carrying out frequent mass casualty attacks across the nation. And while the ISS lacks the manpower or the firepower to challenge any of those factions directly, they work together to create a near-perfect environment for a light-footed, asymmetrical insurgency to thrive. Holed up in the mountains, the ISS has little to fear from Puntlands, who've been unable to take the heart of ISS territory despite continuous support for their autonomous security forces from the United States. Operating what basically amounts to a security vacuum, the ISS has had the freedom to not only plan attacks, but to do the sorts of large-scale planning and logistical work that other Islamic State branches in other countries can't get the time and the space to carry out. The ISS has taken a leading role in funding and building up other Islamic State franchises, both in other African nations and across the world, taking advantage of local revenue streams from local communities and friendly pirates on the coast. Quoting the Associated Press here, US military officials have warned that IS cells have received increasing direction from the group's leadership that relocated to northern Somalia. That has included how to kidnap Westerners for ransom, how to learn better military tactics, how to hide from drones, and how to build their own small quadcopters. End quote. This little IS affiliate has been instrumental in this phase of the Islamic State movement, where around the world the group is mostly an underground insurgency despite elements in Syria that appear to be gathering strength. As a result, it should hopefully make a good deal more sense just why the United States would be so interested in attacking the ISS. Rather than being a simple performative strike carried out by an administration that wants to look tough in front of domestic news outlets, the airstrike in the Golis Mountains is part of an ongoing American attempt to attack the heart of a growing spiderweb. Sure, you can try to put out little fires caused by Islamic State franchises from Africa to Asia to the Middle East, or you can go after a franchise that seems to play an outsized role in the development of so many of the others. It's the latter option that the United States apparently chose, and it's that path that led bombs to drop onto the heads of an unknown number of ISS militants on the 1st of February. Nor is this an isolated action by the United States. In fact, local reporting out of Puntland suggests that the strikes are part of a broader initiative aimed at finally rooting the ISS out of their power base. The effort is called Operation Hillaac, and according to independent Somali outlet Garo Online, that operation is now in its final phases. Taking place throughout the Bari region, where the ISS is at its strongest, the operation is meant to fully eradicate the ISS from the area, liberating communities and surging humanitarian aid in the process. According to a mid-January article from Garo Online, quote, officials from Puntland's Ministry of Security confirmed that the operation has successfully dismantled several hideouts and logistical networks used by the militants in mountainous areas, including the rugged terrain of the Golis Mountains, where ISS operatives have traditionally maintained a stronghold. Quote ends. On the 3rd of February, 2 days after the American airstrike, Puntland officials announced that a senior ISS commander was captured alive when he surrendered to authorities in the mountains. The man in question, Abdirahman Hillaac al-Sassid, led the ISS's specialized assassination squad and had overseen the group's efforts to extort local businesses. With that successful capture, Puntland has notched yet another critical victory over the course of an operation that's seen a range of ISS targets cleared out or destroyed. And in fact, it appears entirely likely that the US airstrike on the 1st of February was well coordinated to Puntland's broader operation. According to Puntland officials, their front lines were close enough to the site of the airstrike at the time that it happened that their troops could hear the explosions. And while there's not direct evidence to support this next claim, it's not unlikely that American assets are embedded on the ground to assist. According to Garo Online, quoting here, advanced tactical strategies including air surveillance and coordinated ground offensives have been employed to maximize the operation's impact. That's not an easy thing for Puntland to pull off by itself, but it's the bread and butter of American and Allied Special Forces soldiers who could make a very large difference here, even in small numbers and even without taking part in the fighting directly. So although this airstrike in northern Somalia has mostly been explained in Western media as a one-off attack against a dangerous Islamic State member, it may in fact be a rare case of America's Trump administration underselling its own achievements. Operation Hillaac is still ongoing. It's making major progress in the Somali mountains. It appears to be benefiting greatly from whatever tactical and strategic help that the United States provides, and it's currently poised to eliminate a critical node in the Islamic State network. Unfortunately, even a total victory for Operation Hillaac isn't likely to be the end of the Islamic State worldwide. After all, these same leaders that relocated and set up shop in northern Somalia will simply do the same thing somewhere else if they're able to survive that long. But it's a major victory, nonetheless, for the global effort to destroy one of the most dangerous jihadist insurgencies of the modern day. Europe needs, basically, a surge in defense. For over a decade now, American officials have grown hoarse saying variations of these words, imploring their cousins across the pond to raise their game in an increasingly hostile world. So it must have come as a nice surprise to the Pentagon when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that exact quote at a press conference. And she didn't stop there. To quote, "For many, many years, we have underinvested in defense. Thus, there's a great urgency to increase the defense spending with a big magnitude." Nor was von der Leyen the only one pushing Europeans to do more. At the same time, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, declared, "We are not yet doing enough. There should be no doubt in any of our minds that we must spend more to prevent war." The occasion for these announcements was an informal leaders' summit that the European Union convened on Monday specifically to discuss defence spending, although its remit went far beyond the EU's borders. Alongside leaders from all 27 EU states were NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But really, it was someone sat over 6,000 kilometres away in Washington, D.C., who the summit was designed to impress. Ever since Donald Trump won the November election, European states have been rushing to show that they're serious about military spending. Coming ahead of a formal white paper in March, the summit was meant to show that the continent gets where the president is coming from and is willing to carry a greater share of its security burden. In that sense, it was a success. Aside from von der Leyen's speech, you had President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, promising the bloc would focus on filling credibility gaps in its arsenal, and leaders of all stripes declaring that hikes in defense spending would be necessary. But this being the EU, it all came with a catch. As Reuters dryly noted, quoted here via VOA, the leaders left largely unanswered the question of how their planned surge in defense spending would be paid for. Now, as we'll see later in this segment, that's because the question of funding European defense is trickier and more tiresome than even the most arcane theological debate. Before we get into that, though, we just want to quickly fill you in on what exactly is missing from the old continent's arsenals. The biggest issue is that there are whole sectors that Europe is entirely reliant on America for. Air-to-air refueling and long-range precision missiles just are not something the continent does without US support. And while Monday's summit featured the leaders of two nuclear powers, France and the UK, neither has the full triad of launch options that America has, and both possess only a tiny fraction of the number of nukes that Russia does. Perhaps more importantly, Europe lacks integrated air and missile defense. And as we've seen in Ukraine, a war with Russia would almost certainly see the Kremlin target civilian population centers for destruction. But it's not just areas where the continent lacks capabilities that are the issue. There are also deep problems even in sectors where European nations excel. Take the issue of duplication. Because each EU nation fields its own military and many have their own defense industrial bases, you get lots of variations on the same basic piece of kit. And so you get situations like the one in Ukraine, where, as the New York Times points out, European nations have delivered 17 different kinds of howitzers, all with their own servicing and maintenance requirements. Such duplication is terrible on a continent-wide scale because it means that way more has to be spent to achieve far worse outcomes. To see what we mean, just take a glance at EU defense spending in pure dollar terms. According to European estimates, the bloc's collective defense spend in 2024 was equivalent to 1.9% of GDP. It doesn't sound like a lot, but then you see what that actually adds up to. It's $334.5 billion. Now, that's only a little over a third of the $960 billion that the US spent on defense in 2023, but it's more than the $296 billion the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates China spent, and way more than the $109 billion that Russia spent. And the EU total isn't even including the near $75 billion that the United Kingdom budgets for its military. This is what's so frustrating about being a European who wants Europe to get its shit together. Often, the issue isn't that serious money isn't being spent, but that it's being spent in incredibly inefficient ways. The Greek Prime Minister recently wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times calling for the consolidation and specialization of Europe's defense industry. But until that happens, the continent will need to keep spending more to get less. Hence, perhaps, why some of the targets for the future are so ambitious. The EU Commission wants the bloc to spend an additional $510 billion over the next decade. Meanwhile, Poland and the Baltic states want the EU to splurge $100 billion by 2027, on top of all the money nations are already spending independently. That is, to use a technical term, one goddamn massive pile of money. And as you might expect, Europeans are divided on how to raise those funds. One school of thought, backed by nations such as France and Greece, suggests that the bloc should issue common debt, something it did to raise money at the height of the pandemic. But the more austere northern nations like Germany and the Netherlands see this as funding their spendthrift neighbours and want no part of it. So far, a consensus seems to be forming for a compromise, which Reuters reports as, quote, borrowing to finance loans rather than grants for military projects. But even if that gets the go-ahead, there will still be arguments, the biggest of which is likely to be over where the money gets spent. Countries with significant defense industrial bases like France would prefer that any grants or loans come with a Buy European clause. The idea is that not only would the money help the continent rearm, but it would also strengthen domestic industry and generate jobs. On paper, sounds like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But then you realize how many years it will take for these investments to translate into a robust arms industry, and then you begin to see why countries on the front line with Russia think the idea is insane. Depending on who you listen to, the window of time between the war in Ukraine ending and Russia launching an attack on a NATO member could be anywhere from a mere 7 years to a hair-raising 3. For Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those are 3 years in which they want to be buying enormous amounts of kit, even if that means hurling European money at American or South Korean weapons manufacturers. Or as Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kozyniak-Kamysz told Politico, quote, we are interested in the best equipment which can be supplied as quickly as possible. Of course, the added bonus of doing things the Polish way is that it's likely to mollify President Trump, who probably isn't going to be too upset if the EU suddenly declares it's handing hundreds of billions to American companies that support US-based jobs. And that may even be part of Warsaw's plan, since a major pillar of Poland's security strategy is keeping America tethered to Europe. The downside, though, is that buying American or South Korean will stop Europe from building up its own cash-starved defense industrial base. Nor will splashing cash necessarily keep Trump on side. After all, 63% of all EU defense orders are already placed with American firms, and the president is still skeptical of the continent's value. For those who've been following Europe's dithering over defense since February 2022, these sorts of arguments won't be new. What is different this time is that time itself is running out, and that means solutions will be needed fast. Already, High Commissioner Kaja Kallas and Defense Commissioner Andrius Kubilius are meant to be putting together a firm plan for improving the bloc's defense capability. Following the white paper due next month, leaders will have only till June to talk over ideas before they need to vote on it. That's an incredibly short window of time to iron out these sorts of major differences. But failing to agree is not an option. Each moment Europe spends wringing its hands and planning committee meetings instead of rearming is another moment in which the bloc risks slipping further behind its enemies. So far, there are early signs that things could be shifting in the right direction. The Commission is talking about loosening deficit rules to make it easier for countries to splash on defense. And one of the most sensible suggestions to come from Monday's summit was to start learning from Ukrainian defense firms, which have managed to revolutionize drone warfare at speed and on tight budgets. But still, there's a lot more that needs to be done. Hopefully, this week's summit marked the moment that Europe's leaders finally decided to get their collective together, because complicated little arguments about how to raise funds will mean nothing when the bombs start falling on EU cities. And if we want to avoid this outcome, then we need to start spending now. Spending to such a degree that even a tyrant like Putin will think twice before trying to move his empire another inch west. It's now up to our leaders here in Europe to make that hope a reality. It's a string of victories that most armies could only dream of. Last weekend, barely half a month after retaking the strategic city of Wad Madani, the Sudanese armed forces shattered the front lines of their rivals, the rapid support forces in the city of Khartoum North. After nearly 2 years in which the RSF has besieged the military's last holdout base, the blockade was broken in mere hours. Signal Corps and General Command have been liberated. For the army, the victory was charged with symbolism. As the former headquarters of the SAF, the siege and bombardment of Signal Corps and of General Command had long been a stark reminder of the army's failings in the war. A war in which an expected easy win had given way to humiliation as the RSF overran most of the capital of Khartoum and its sister cities Omdurman and Khartoum North. A war in which the army had been forced to flee all the way to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. But if a symbolic victory was all it was, then we wouldn't be covering it here. That it's worthy of the Situation Room treatment is thanks to what this victory suggests might happen next, that the military may win Sudan's catastrophic civil war. Just a few months ago, such a statement would have seemed hopelessly naive, the ravings of an SAF propagandist as deluded as Comical Ali. After all, the Rapid Support Forces had spent the first year and a half of the war notching up improbable victories, overrunning not just most of Khartoum, but almost the whole of Darfur and striking deep into the agricultural states of Sudan's south. As recently as July, the New Arab was able to run the headline, "Is Sudan's army on the verge of collapse?" So poor was the military's performance judged to have been that its own soldiers were asking leader General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to resign. Since then, though, the fortunes of the two warring sides have completely flipped. Starting with a surprise offensive the military launched in Khartoum in September, capturing 3 key bridges, the RSF has spent the last few months watching their hard-fought gains be swept away. Over October and November, the army forced its way back into the agricultural heartlands of Sennar State, recapturing the regional capital of Sinjar. Around the same time, the Darfur militia, known as the Joint Force, allied itself with the military and launched stinging attacks on the RSF in their western homeland. But it was the liberation of Wad Madani in early January that really made it seem like the tide of conflict might be turning. As we covered in our episode at the time, Wad Madani sits on crucial supply routes. Whoever controls it dominates not just the agricultural states, but some of the main roads leading into Khartoum. Well, it seems like the military is preparing to make use of those roads. Following the breaking of the siege around Signal Corps and General Command, SAF fighters have been sweeping through Khartoum North, securing the districts across the river from the capital, as well as the McNamara Bridge connecting the two cities. At the time of writing, on Thursday, the Sudan Tribune claims that, having held most of the city for almost 2 years, quote, "The RSF presence is now limited to the southwestern part of Khartoum North, specifically in Hillaac. Should the army be able to dislodge them, their likely next steps will be to cross the river in force and try to break the siege of a final base where the armored corps are holding out. They may also target Khartoum International Airport before preparing for a final push across the city." In the words of the Independent Sudan War Monitor, quote, "This development is turning points in the ongoing civil war, ending the threat to the SAF headquarters and positioning SAF for a new push to recapture the capital." Now, a serious attempt to retake the whole of Khartoum is probably still some weeks away. We're unlikely to see a Syria-style situation where lines just crumble and the army seizes the capital in a swift, bloodless victory. Still, the momentum is doubtless with General al-Burhan. Flush with weapons supplied by Iran, newly backed by allied militias who've decided the RSF represent an existential threat, and pumped up by their recent string of victories, the Sudanese armed forces seem in the best position yet to actually win this apocalyptic war. And that raises a vital question. What happens next? What would it really mean if the army were to pursue total victory? To be clear, not everyone believes al-Burhan wants to fight to the end. Speaking to Reuters, several analysts suggested that the SAF's game plan may be to expel the RSF from Khartoum and then open negotiations once the capital is under control. On the other hand, al-Burhan himself has suggested that the war will continue. Al Jazeera quotes him making a victory speech at the liberated headquarters, quote, "vowing to eradicate the RSF and pursue its fighters in every corner of Sudan." That's going to be a tall order. While the RSF have been driven out much of the south and are looking increasingly tenuous around Khartoum in the center, they still hold much of Kordofan to the west and effectively the whole of Darfur, barring the besieged city of Al Fasher. That is an area larger than the nation of Spain under the paramilitary's control. It's also their homeland, with the bulk of the RSF fighters recruited from the nomadic Arab tribes of Darfur. Should the army now take Khartoum and try marching west, they're likely to discover that the RSF are far more entrenched. Indeed, analyst Amgad Farid El-Tayeb told Al Jazeera that they expect the paramilitaries to now redouble their efforts to seize Al Fasher and declare Darfur an independent state. Quoting here, "What the RSF and its allies want is to fully take over Darfur in order to establish a government, leaving Sudan with a model similar to what happened in Libya." And what happened in Libya, of course, was a petitioning of the nation between warring generals. Should retaking Khartoum prove tougher than expected, al-Burhan might be willing to at least temporarily leave Darfur outside of the military's control. But if he decides to drive west, then we should expect Sudan's already apocalyptic war to get even worse. And sadly, it will be civilians who are likely to bear the brunt of it. Right now, the RSF are conducting genocide in Darfur, slaughtering the men and children of tribes like the Masalit and enslaving their women. Infamously, they may have massacred as many as 15,000 non-Arab residents after seizing control of the city of El Geneina in 2023. Yet the Sudanese armed forces are hardly angels. They stand accused of using chemical weapons against the RSF, of starvation as a weapon of war in South Kordofan, and indiscriminately shelling civilian areas. Most recently, videos have emerged from Wad Madani after its liberation, showing militias allied with the SAF targeting and killing civilians based on their ethnicity. As Al Jazeera has written, quote, "The RSF has typically recruited fighters from its core tribal base in western Sudan, and the army has regularly treated civilians from these regions as RSF collaborators." Those allied militias are also worrying for other reasons. The Sudan Shield Forces, for example, are led by a former RSF commander who is alleged to have carried out all sorts of war crimes before defecting. Meanwhile, the Al-Bara bin Malik Battalion are hardcore Islamists with murky links to the former regime of deposed dictator Omar al-Bashir. Then there's the role Iran is playing in the army's recent string of victories. After the RSF's main backer, the United Arab Emirates, effectively bribed Egypt with promises of investment to drop its support for the Sudanese army, General al-Burhan turned to whatever allies he could get. After flirting with Russia, which had initially backed the RSF, al-Burhan eventually settled on Tehran, which has since sent multiple cargo flights carrying weapons to Sudan. The problem is that Iran is pretty open about what it would like in return: a port on Sudan's Red Sea coast. So far, al-Burhan hasn't caved, but if the military requires more Iranian largesse to retake Darfur, then saying no to its main supporter might become harder and harder. These are just some of the potential issues surrounding the army's renewed push for victory. Issues that may not yet be accurate, but have the power to cause serious problems in the future. Then, what are the other options? A negotiated settlement that leaves the RSF in control of Darfur, a land where they are literally carrying out a genocide, or some sort of outside intervention that no one, not America, not Europe, not the African Union, wants to lead? Well, whatever your thoughts on Sudan's army, the fact is that they, for now at least, appear to be winning the war. The fighting in Sudan may have already killed over 150,000 people. But as the military prepares for its final push into Khartoum, it may turn out that such bloodshed was merely the beginning. And in our closing story for the day, we're headed to the Congo, where the siege and sudden takeover of the major city of Goma by an internationally sponsored rebel group has thrown the nation and the region into chaos. With the rebel movement M23 now clearly on the rise in the Congo's resource-rich eastern provinces, the rest of the world has started to take notice of a crisis that's been brewing for years. The M23 rebels first claimed to have captured Goma on Monday, January the 27th, although it now appears that it took them a few days to move through the entire city. After a series of collapses in their defensive positions across the surrounding region, the military forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo were expected to make at least some sort of stand in Goma, and to some of their credit, it appears that elements of the DRC military did just that. Others allegedly fled en masse on boats across Lake Kivu, the large lake that abuts the city. This left hundreds of thousands of people who fled M23 by traveling into Goma, now at M23's mercy. According to the United Nations, M23 forces were supported by indeterminate numbers of Rwandan troops, further offering support to a claim, recognized by the US and most of Europe, that neighboring Rwanda is supporting M23 as a proxy force in what amounts to a land grab. The UN's peacekeeping chief suggested that the number of Rwandans in Goma may have been as high as 4,000, perhaps validating fears that Rwandan troops would sweep into the city from their own territory. Goma is built up to the DRC-Rwanda border. Within a few days, it appeared that M23 had taken control of Goma's key defensible targets and its international airport in a sweeping conclusion to an offensive that had taken years to reach a crescendo. Reports from inside the city suggest that the situation, since the M23 takeover, has gotten dark. Amidst accounts from locals that Rwandan troops were walking around openly in their military uniforms of their home nation, other reports suggested that artillery shelling continued for days, flushing out remaining Congolese fighters. Rwanda countered accusations of its involvement by showing its own footage on state TV, depicting several Congolese soldiers surrendering after crossing into the Rwandan town of Rubavu, directly across the border where Goma is located. Artillery bombardments reportedly hit a maternity hospital and a camp for displaced people, causing multiple civilian casualties in both locations, while looting mobs spread throughout the city after thousands of prisoners staged a jailbreak from Goma's main detention facility. Cholera is spreading, medicine and medical staff are scarce, and many humanitarian aid groups have had to pull up stakes in order to keep their own people safe. Estimates from the DRC's health ministry, up to date as of the 30th of January, indicated that 773 bodies were accounted for in Goma's hospital morgues, that those morgues were overfilled, and more bodies, to the health ministry's own admission, were scattered through the streets. The DRC's health ministry reported nearly 3,000 wounded during the days of the heaviest fighting. A spokesperson for the Congolese government claimed that M23 had told Goma residents to clear the streets of bodies, suggesting that there are now probably new mass graves in or around the city to hold them. Those same residents are now at M23's mercy, a frightening prospect given that the group is accused of engaging at scale in a wide range of crimes against humanity. According to New York Times reporters embedded on the ground, food and water resources are now all but depleted in the city, while over 1,000 Congolese soldiers have been taken captive, reportedly outraged with the Congo's own president, Felix Tshisekedi, for allegedly having sold them out. According to those soldiers and other sources, the people who fled across Lake Kivu before the battle began were a combination of military commanders and Congolese government officials. In the immediate aftermath of their takeover, M23 vowed publicly to march to the country's capital city of Kinshasa and deal with Felix Tshisekedi themselves before taking over the rest of the country. Luckily for the people who'd be caught in the middle of such an advance, that's an unlikely prospect for now. Kinshasa and Goma are separated by almost 1,000 miles, and the country is about the same size as the entirety of Western Europe, making an outright takeover a difficult thing to achieve. But that has not stopped M23 from pressing their advantage either. Immediately after taking Goma, M23 troops pivoted southward, preparing to make a push from the city they'd just taken, also the provincial capital of North Kivu province, to the capital of neighboring South Kivu province, Bukavu. By road, Bukavu is about 200 kilometers away from Goma, although you can take an alternate route to get there through Rwanda or cross Lake Kivu outright. Bukavu is also situated on the Rwandan border on the lake's southern tip, whereas Goma was close to the northern tip. It's a really big lake. But unfortunately for the people of Bukavu, or fortunately for those who support M23, the group is a whole lot closer than 200 kilometers. They got to Goma by taking much of the territory between the two cities, and now M23 is reported to be close to what Al Jazeera describes as, quote, a strategic military airport in the city of Kavumu, located about 40 kilometers or 25 miles north of Bukavu. The quote ends. Now, according to the United Nations, M23 is, quote, moving rapidly towards Bukavu, a city of about 2 million. The situation has led to a rapid degradation of the remaining ties between Rwanda and the DRC, with the Congo cutting off contact and accusing Rwanda of having functionally declared war. Felix Tshisekedi made a show of skipping a virtual crisis summit with Rwanda's leader Paul Kagame, meant to soothe the situation with the assistance of regional mediators. Meanwhile, Rwanda has continued to deny involvement in the fighting and blame the Congolese government for the violence. The Congo has appealed to the UN Security Council to begin a sanctions regime against Rwanda, while foreign governments from the United States to Europe to much of Africa have urged the two sides to find their way to a ceasefire. Romania, in particular, has a stake in the fighting, as about 280 Romanian mercenaries were confirmed to have surrendered to M23. That's according to Rwanda's military. For Rwanda's part, the nation has worked to redirect attention to M23's claim as a liberating influence in the Congo and as an ethnic Tutsi group charged with fighting Hutu militias that Rwanda insists would collaborate with the DRC government to slaughter the Tutsis, harkening back to the Rwandan genocide of decades past. That, despite the reality that M23's ideal aims haven't really mattered for a while now. To be clear, M23 did start out as a liberationist movement, gaining their name from a March 23, 2009 peace deal that their founding members insisted the Congo would refuse to implement amidst the exploitation of local mineral wealth. But as history has proven time and time again, you can believe in and claim a liberationist cause while still perpetrating, frankly, stupid amounts of human rights abuses, and that's precisely the sort of group that M23 is. On January the 31st, the United Nations Human Rights Office alleged that war crimes committed by M23 in the last several days included at least a dozen summary executions, alongside dozens of new cases of sexual violence by Congolese soldiers and pro-government militias. Sexual violence is regularly used as a weapon of war by both sides. As M23 has intensified its southward offensive, its fighters have come into increasing contact with not just soldiers from the Congo, but soldiers from neighboring Burundi as well. The involvement of Burundian troops in the fighting adds yet another international layer to the conflict, alongside the heavy-handed role of Rwanda. Burundi has vowed to defend and fight alongside the DRC in this coming showdown in what's become a rapidly morphing mission for the small African nation. Burundi had stationed troops in the DRC for years prior to this, mostly to hunt down their own rebels operating out of isolated pockets of the Congo. But now, the situation on the ground has created a distinct possibility that Rwandan and Burundian troops will fight directly in the Congo. According to Jason Stearns, a former UN investigator in the Congo, giving information to Reuters, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 Burundian soldiers are believed to be on the ground fighting M23. Nor would Burundi be particularly opposed to fighting Rwandan troops if the moment arrives. Burundi is ruled by a predominantly ethnic Hutu administration, as opposed to Rwanda's ethnic Tutsis, and Burundi still holds a rather understandable grudge for what it claims was a coup attempt in 2015 that Rwanda had directly organized. Nor is Burundi the only other African nation currently embroiled in the Congo conflict. South Africa has kept peacekeepers in the country for some time now, mostly in an effort to try and force the fighting factions to calm down, but those efforts have since failed. 7 South African troops were killed in the eastern DRC in 2024, but 13 have been killed just in the month of January alone. South Africa's president has alleged that M23 was responsible for their deaths, and the nation has signaled that it would consider further attacks on South African peacekeepers to be a declaration of war. Rwandan leader Paul Kagame responded with accusations that South Africa was a, quote, belligerent force, helping the DRC government to, quote, fight against its own people. Much like the case with Burundi, there's really no lost love between Rwanda and South Africa, and now the two leaders have spent upwards of a week trading accusations. South Africa's role as a peacekeeper has been shown through this most recent explosion of violence to have diminished far past what it used to be. The nation's attack helicopters, once so effective in beating back M23 during previous periods of rebel strength, now languish without repair or refurbishment and are unable to fly. The latest news, at the time of writing at the start of the day Eastern Congo time on the 4th of February, initially seems to be positive. M23 has unilaterally declared a ceasefire and announced that actually it has no intention of capturing the city of Bukavu. But not only does that claim ring a little bit hollow, especially given recent events, but if past predicts future, then the fate of past ceasefires in the Congo war would indicate that M23 will take a moment to breathe, consolidate their positions, and go on the attack again shortly after. At the time of writing, it's also not clear that the DRC will even respect the ceasefire. After all, it could interpret such an act as a moment of weakness for the rebels and try to surge an offensive while they have the chance. Whatever the case may be, it's highly unlikely that either M23 or Rwanda or the DRC or the international community are going to let this situation rest. This corner of the DRC is so important to the international community, not just because bad things are happening there, but because it is incredibly rich in natural resources. While the area around Lake Kivu lacks the copper and cobalt that are so abundant in much of the Congo and almost nowhere else on Earth, the Kivu area has a wealth of gold, tungsten, the corrosion-resistant silvery metal tantalum, and the pedestrian-sounding but surprisingly rare and valuable element, tin. Goma is a critical transit point for these metals en route to Tanzania and the global trade system, and Goma is now in the hands of a rebel group that seems to be directly under Rwanda's control. As crude as it sounds, and indeed as crude as it is, control over those resources is of paramount importance not just for the DRC and Rwanda, but for the rest of the world. Putting a friendly, stable power in charge of that area based on whatever definition of both friendly and stable that any given world nation would choose to adopt ensures the safe exploitation and use of those minerals. When it comes to making a profit, war is bad for everyone. But this particular war cannot end until control of Goma is settled, and for much of the world, control of Goma cannot become a settled issue if a resolution would leave M23 and Rwanda in charge. Thank you for watching.